So as I said, welcome. Today's special seminar is on Indigenous data sovereignty. It really is, I think, a wonderful opportunity to have somebody like Dr. Maggie Walter, who is here with us this semester. She's a visiting Fulbright professor. Dr. Walter is, from North Eastern Tasmania. I'll let you, I can't pronounce all of these things, so I may let her do some of that.
I'm from the pairrebenne people.
There we go. She holds dual roles as Professor of Sociology and Vice-Chancellor of Aboriginal Research and Leadership at the University of Tasmania. Dr. Walter is really, I think, for some of us who work in this area, really kind of a leading figure when it comes to issues of especially quantitative work. She has co-authored with a number of different colleagues a couple of really important books. One of them includes Indigenous Statistics, a 2013 publication from Routledge. She's also a co-author or editor on Indigenous Children Growing Up Strong, a 2017 publication. She's also the founding member of the Australian Indigenous Data Sovereignty Collective and has published extensively on this topic. Most recently, this includes The Voice of Indigenous Data Beyond the Markers of Disadvantage and Indigenous Data, Indigenous Methodologies, and Indigenous Sovereignty. I'm sorry, I'm working on a cold and I'm having a hard time here. But it's really wonderful to have her here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Maggie very quickly. I apologize for the rough introduction. And I'll go retrieve our other speaker and do her introduction in a few moments.
You should meet her on the way.
I will.
Hopefully you don't.
Okay.
Yeah, Palingina. That's hello and welcome in Palawakani, the reconstructed and revived language of the Aboriginal Palawa people of Tasmania, of whom I am a member of the larger Briggs Johnson Aboriginal family. We're quite a large family, there's about 2,000 of us. This are some other members of that family. So this is where we come from in Tasmania, all come from the northeast. That's Manalagena, who is my great-great-great-great-grandfather, and his, my grandmother, Dalrymple Johnson, and my dad, down there at the bottom. So we have a fairly tragic history that's worth mentioning. All of us who are alive today come from six women only. So only 6 women survived of the roughly between 5,000 to 10,000, nobody knows exactly, people who were living in Tasmania Lutruwita when the British arrived in 1803. And actually the deprivations began a bit before that, because in the late 1700s, 1797, 1798, a whole lot of seals were found on these islands up there in the Flinders Island region. And a whole lot of sealers from all over the world, but especially coming out of Port Jackson, which was what Sydney was known as at the time, headed down there. And they quickly found that the Aboriginal women were the best seal hunters, so women were being kidnapped, including Wasamotayena, Manalagena's daughter, and my great-great-great-grandmother. So to the sealers, not to their credit, but by accident managed actually to save us, because the only people who survived were women who were kidnapped and their progeny. Everybody else was taken to Waibalena on Flinders Island and quickly died from disease and Christianisation. Okay, so my colleague Stephanie is here. We've got a seat. We've got a table here and everything. Oh, we're a little bit of, we're going to do the thing today, because we got just word this morning that our new book on Indigenous data sovereignty is accepted by Routledge. We have to write it now. That's an edited collection with people from here included in those new authors. So as a bit of a background, I'm just going to talk about Indigenous life worlds. So this is a new concept and something that I've been working with for a little while now, and it's part of the explanation as to why we, as very different peoples, Guinea, Palawa, have exactly the same experience around data. So it says that if we are a dispossessed people, a colonised people, and I know that word sometimes can be a bit bring up, people will contest or not, but if you don't have all the lands that you had before the British arrived, then I think that's called colonisation and dispossession. then we have to have this dual intersubjectivity of who we are. So we aren't, the way we live our lives, our embedded lived reality is not the same as it was for our ancestors before the British or the Spanish or a combination of the two got here. But that doesn't mean that we are just colonised people. That doesn't define us. We still have all that, but we have them, and those things have to be entangled within how we live our lives as marginalised peoples now and the deprivations and the disadvantage we suffer because of that. So that's when we talk about how, as a palawa woman, as an Aboriginal woman, I can talk with Stephanie here, it's because of those similarities. And they say that the footprint of British colonialism is the easiest thing to track in the world because we're still living with all the systems of governance. And those systems of governance around data are central to what we're talking about today. So this is just a quick thing of what we mean by Indigenous data. And I apologise to some of the students who came along to the quantitative workshop that some of these slides you will have seen before. Yep. So data, we're mostly talking statistics and population statistics, but we mean something much wider. And we've been really pleased with this new upcoming volume that we're doing, that Tanil Marley from here is going to be talking more about qualitative data and moving the conversation on. That's really important. So that's our data. So moving back to stats, the big thing is stats are not neutral. Yes, numbers exist, they definitely exist, but what their meaning is totally a socio-cultural artefact. How we ascribe those meanings and how we shape those meanings and what meanings we take from those numbers depends on who we are. And it also depends very much on who is generating those numbers and for what purpose. And the real thing, of course, here is that primarily that is not us. So we have a data desert from what we actually need to know, huge amounts of data about the sorts of things, well, they're largely descriptive, and very little of us being the data producers. Again, that explains that similarity. So, bad data, I call the sins of Indigenous statistics. So they're fairly easy to track, but it helps to have something that actually rounds it out to say this is what it is. So the BADA works really effectively just as a tie. So you've got blameworthy, and I'll show you examples of these: aggregate, decontextualised, deficit and reductive. And they mostly come out to positioning us in the national narrative, whether it be in the US national narrative, in the Australian national narrative, or even in the Tasmanian state narrative, as problematic people. We are the problem, and the numbers provide the evidence base for how we are problematised. But we're not just seen as a problem, we're actually seen as causing our own problems. So I've pulled these data. When we did the class last week, I got people just to Google Native American statistics, and you'll see very quickly what comes up. It's just all this sort of stuff. So, and we talked then about, yes, maybe that is a real reflection of illicit drug users by race and ethnicity. The question is, why produce that data and why produce that graph? Who did it? What was their purpose? Now, we know that many of our communities have had drug and alcohol problems for a very long time. But we just get this constant stream of it being reflected back and back and back, and it's always descriptive. It's always just what. There's never any why in there. And it sort of positions us as being complicit, if not actually the cause. Similarly, it's aggregate. So you just get these Native American - Alaskan Native, that's it. NAAN, reduced to a sort of a little just descriptor like that. And so if you really were interested about alcohol problems in Native American or Alaskan Native communities, you wouldn't just produce national data. It's pretty useless unless your purpose is to create a national narrative around who Native American and Alaska Native people are, built around alcohol use. And here it's quite definitely called alcohol abuse. And so this is the American Medical Association puts this crap out. So it's a bit dispiriting when your National Medical Association sees you in these terms. It's decontextualised. It's always about what. And it goes on and on and on. And we've laughed about this and say sometimes you think that the national statistics that they produce about native peoples in these Western colonised countries, all they're doing is really just checking that colonisation's still working. It's just sort of say, okay, tick, yep, okay, still got the highest rates of alcohol consumption, yes. Tick, still got the lowest levels of education, tick, still got diabetes, right, we're doing okay. And it's all deficit. So pejoratively positioned around those 5 Ds: deficit, different, disparity, disadvantage and dysfunction. Again, you know, I'm not making these graphs, I didn't make these graphs. These are graphs that are out there and easily grabbed, and they are what people know about Native Americans. So I did a study in Australia, and I've done it a couple of times now, at a national level, where I actually asked non-Indigenous Australians how many Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people they know, or if they know any. And only about 10% know any. And when I asked them in a follow-up survey, where do they know them? They mostly know them from work. So as clients or co-workers. So if you don't know any Native American people, then this is the only picture you've got. And we talk, it's also despairing because it's often the only picture we have of ourselves. Because we've got that data desert about what else we want to know about us. And for all those, who does stats in the room? Nobody wants to admit it, so you've got a few? I do. Okay. You're going to get a big serious growl from me if I see any models where Native American, non-Native American or 4 or 5 different racial groupings are just plugged into your model as if they are a variable in of themselves. They're not. They're a concept. And you can't demonstrate that concept with just a 1 or a 0. Okay, so this is about the social cultural artefacts. And so when we look at all those data, we see who they're being produced for and who's producing them and for what purpose. And you can see that we are not in the picture. So the purpose is very much often from government, but often also other big organisations, philanthropic groups, whatever. But there is a trope. So people just learn from the data they see and they think that's how you do Indigenous data. They don't see it as becoming anything else. They then control the process and that determines the content. So we get the same thing again and again and again. And I'm constantly in arguments, and I'm talking to them again tomorrow with our Australian Bureau of Statistics, who tell me that they can't change the questions in the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders health survey because they've been asking them repetitively for the last 20 years. And they say, well, yes, you can, because if it was rubbish in 1994, it sure as hell is still rubbish now, and having lots of data points of rubbish over time is not making the case any better. But this is where you need people who know what they're doing with stats, because what happens is these organisations fill up their reference groups with people from community who don't know about the stats. And so when they get told a stupid answer like that, they go, oh, okay. Or don't know how to question it, don't know how to call them on their bluff. So the question we're asking is about data for governance and governance for data, and we're asking what would it look like if we were doing all these things. If we were the instigators and the process determinators, if it was our values and social cultural realities that were reflected, if we defined what it was important to know, and if we decided what content best meet our needs, and even more dramatically, what if we were the intended audience? It's not going to look like those graphs I just showed you, is it? And so this is work from Kukatai, Tahu Kukatai and myself, about the functionality gap, about the data we have and the data we need. And you can see that there's very little overlap. Mind you, obviously I made it that way, but there is, in reality, there is very little overlap between the data we have and the data we need. They're at two extreme ends of a continuum. Well, theirs is extreme end, ours is right in the middle. So this is when we come to really the need for Indigenous data sovereignty, which is the governance of data and ending the domination of that data of disregard, and then supporting data for governance, the data that we require at all levels to support nation building. And at this stage, I think that's Indigenous data sovereignty, but I think I'm going to hand it over to Steph now, and she can take on with the conceptual things.
Excellent.
I'll just do an escape there.
Did you do a land acknowledgement?
No, I didn't. It was Angela. It was terrible. Very. I will do one now. I really am very, very grateful to be here on these lands, and my elders, past, present and future, all thank you, and I pay my respects to your elders, past, present and emerging, and it's wonderful to see so many Native people in the room. It really is.
Sidak Atnakastan, Sidak Stephanie Carroll Rainey, Tishu Ska, Slandek Nelchina. So I'm Stephanie Carroll Rainey. I'm Atna Athabasca and a citizen of the native village of Clutie Ka in Alaska. That's along the Copper River. And I am from the Pairrebenne clan, and my dad is from the Down from the Sky clan, and this is not working. And my mom's family immigrated to the US from Sicily. So, why can't I put this in? I am an assistant professor in public health at the other university, Arizona's first university. And I have also worked at the Native Nations Institute at the Udall Center for Studies in Public Policy at the U of A since it started in 2001. So, I'm going to give a conceptual background to some of the information that Maggie shared with you. There will be some overlap. You'll see me reiterating some of her definitions. I also want to say off the bat that I have a lot of picture-y type imaging things. I did not do that. Andrew Martinez, who works for me, did that. He takes words and makes them into images and much more understandable, which is awesome, and I always get compliments on that, so I wanted to make sure just to see that. You heard me say to Maggie, did you give a land acknowledgement? And this is something that I'm pushing here because when I go to Australia and to her lands, I always hear people recognize the territories that we're on. And by doing so, what you're recognizing is the people and the peoples who are there and who have been there. And as I do this more and more in my practice here in Arizona, and as I travel, the primary comment that I get back from people is gratitude for doing that, because what it does is it makes us visible. It brings the invisible and our marginalization forward. And so I challenge all of you to do that. I do it now as a regular practice at the start of public meetings and gatherings, as well as in the classroom. I also do it over web meetings as well, to acknowledge both the lands that I'm on, but those of the peoples that I'm speaking with as well. And so it's really important to do that in a daily practice, pretty much. And so I said again, my background is in public health, but I really work at the intersection of public health, Indigenous governance, and the environment. And I get pushback sometimes from my college about what I do around Indigenous data sovereignty and governance work is public health, and I'll talk a little bit about that more as we go through the slides. But one of the things that I also do is work with Maggie at the international level, and so this is our recent trip to Gaborone, Botswana, for the International Data Week there, where we were dreaming up and imagining some Indigenous data governance principles applicable at the international level. And we always seem to make sure that we get out on the land. This time we went up to Kale Hill, which is the highest point in Botswana. and hiked up there. This is us near the top there. And one of the things that I was really remarking on when we're hiking there is Kali means a long time ago. And so the work that we do really is to tie a long time ago and our remembrance and our ancestors to what we practice and live today, but also for future generations. And so I always have my children in mind when I do this work. Last night my son was asking me again about Indigenous data sovereignty, and he said, "Mama, stop those science words." This is an 8-year-old. I was like, oh! So I'll try not to be so science-y in my talk today. It's always good to get that reminder from our little ones. So when we talk about Indigenous peoples, I just want to remind folks the point that I come from, and when we talk internationally, is we use a lot of the UN's language, which is not to define. And it is important to think about all of these concepts when we're thinking about who are Indigenous peoples, who are both individually naming themselves, but also getting recognition from their community as being part and parcel to that community. One of the important things that I want to note here is the UN talks about from non-dominant groups of society. And I like to challenge that repeatedly, because what happens is that's just continued colonization. You think about it in the context of, say, Botswana, who was liberated from the British 50 years ago. And their national system of government is a colonized system of government. And they have chosen a single one of the 7 tribes in the area to be the predominant tribe in the area. And so it's setting us up as Indigenous peoples and pitting us against each other, even in a place where they are the dominant peoples. And so we see that happen in our own country here in the US over and over and over again. And so we must continue always to challenge the language and the conceptualization behind who we are as peoples. So in the US, I just want to give a nod to the fact that there are now 573 federally recognized tribes. I think it's under 60 now, because some of those have flipped to federal recognition. We have Native Hawaiians, excuse me, and many unrecognized tribes who either are seeking recognition or not. We have tribes in the US who are practicing as sovereigns but do not have federal recognition. And the importance of that is that sovereignty does not require us to be recognized by another. So also in the US context, who is Indigenous in the US? And so this varies. The federal government counts Indigenous peoples in many different ways, sometimes by self-identification, sometimes you need to show your certificate degree of Indian blood. Other times you need to be able to provide enrollment. And so there's self-identification, there's recognition by your tribe. There's also counted on the US Census if you're Indigenous to the Americas. It is one of the 2 to 3 largest Indigenous groups in the US by the US Census count, which are Indigenous peoples to the Americas, not from the lower 48 or Alaska. And then we do not here in the US regularly count Indigenous peoples from elsewhere outside of the Americas. And so we need to recognize that there are Indigenous peoples here from other places. So again, sovereignty is self-determination. It is Indigenous peoples and nations making and enforcing their own rules. And those rules are dependent on our choice of governance styles, which is the system of values, policies, and institutions by way we organize ourselves as nations. And I put this up there because we're going to be talking about data governance, but really to point out values. Underlying all of this are our values. And you heard that throughout what Maggie was saying. What are the values that determine what data are collected about us by nation states? What are our values, and how would that shift the type of data that are collected and the stories that we want to tell? Because I am in public health, I do not love the social determinants of health framework. Actually, I met Angela because we were critiquing this framework. But sometimes it is useful to use their tools. And one of the things that I use within my discipline is I say, hey, look it. We always talk about, and the federal government talks about how our neighborhood shapes us, our zip code shapes us, and who we interact with on a daily basis shapes us. These are the social determinants of health. But up there, determining all of that, are the politics and the governance and all the laws and all of that. And so this is a Spanish pathologist, histologist, very dorky man, also a neuroscientist, a Nobel laureate, Santiago Ramon y Cajal. He is a social justice, or was a social justice man before it was the buzzword of our writing here in the US now. And every disease has two causes, both the political and the pathophysiological. And so Indigenous data sovereignty is an opportunity actually to affect both of those. So if you think about it in terms of genomics, you're hitting both of those right on the head. So Maggie talked about Indigenous data already, and I think some of the really important things to understand is that this pushes the mainstream conception, because generally in the mainstream you're only talking about digital information, and we are talking about anything that is digitizable, which today is anything. And so we want to be able to honor and protect all of that knowledge and information and data. So this is Andrew Martinez's #1 slide. It has now been printed in a number of places. And what it lays out is a lot of information in one slide. So we talked about Indigenous data sovereignty as the right to govern, and it derives from our sovereignty, which is inherent, if you like that word or not, but our right to govern our people's lands and resources, to care and to plan and to have aspirations and hopes and dreams, and to align how we live and breathe with all of those. It finds genesis in how we've always cared for our information and our people. So those traditions, roles, and responsibilities for the community, the use and non-use of community-held information. And it is positioned within an international human rights framework. That means that we can utilize the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We can utilize the recognition we may have within our nation states. It is not dependent on those. We can also utilize other human rights frameworks that are now emerging around data to make our arguments as well. And finally, and fundamentally, and this is really tricky for people in the mainstream data world to think about, knowledge belongs to the collective, right? And it's fundamental to who we are as peoples. And so this is our heart and soul, which there is a lot of forgetting in the data world that data are about people, always. Even if you're talking about land, even if you're talking about oil, data are about people. And they're about us as peoples. And so we don't have a lot of policies and laws and practices in the mainstream data world for dealing with data as a collective right. And so this is really where Indigenous people are pushing forward the scholarship and the practice of data, arguably to the benefit of humankind. So sometimes you'll hear me talk about the Indigenous data ecosystem. I learned this last week from Andrew. I never knew it, but all of these that are in this teal color throughout our slide deck are about Indigenous peoples. And when they're not, and when they're in the grayscale, they're about non-Indigenous. Who would have known? I told him, you should have told me that 2 years ago. But our landscape is comprised of data which is held internal to tribes. So our enrollment data, if we run services, our knowledge about our sacred sites, so on and so forth. But also the data landscape and the data which we have the right to control is also data that are out there. And so we have the right to control all of that data. It doesn't mean we have to choose to. You know, some of that information might not be so sensitive and we don't necessarily care if it's out there, and other times it's really cumbersome. Maggie talked about the data desert. And so we've kind of put this schematic together where within the Indigenous data sovereignty world, ideally you want data by us for us or data by us for them, but there is utility to all of these different spheres. What if they don't count us at all? That happens in some countries. They don't count Indigenous peoples. They don't exist. Why would we count them? And so really getting into these zones too can be powerful and transformative. So in order to reach for the aspiration of Indigenous data sovereignty, we need to be governing our data, so this is Indigenous data governance, but we also need to be using data for governance and decolonizing that data. So reframing that data, really questioning whose social cultural context was used to create that data, recreating it if necessary, but also one of the biggest things that I challenge statisticians, epidemiologists, others to do is create new methods and methodologies for working with data and the data process and life cycle. How do we make sure to address us as the asterisk? You know, in most data sets, Indigenous peoples are an asterisk. There's not enough of us to do anything with. And so that's not our problem. That is the problem of Western science, because you're not able to crunch those numbers. And so we need our best and our brightest out there re-envisioning and dreaming how we can create these new processes for working with our own data. And so I don't know if folks have seen this before. This is now probably 6 or 7 years old. But non-white babies now outnumber white babies in America for the first time, and Grandpa says, this is the second time. And so I put this up there really as a challenge to say the story begins with changing the narrative, right? And for on these lands, currently known as America, there's a rich and vibrant history, present and future, that's invisible, suppressed, or ignored in the mainstream. And there is a place for each of us and every one of us to challenge this discourse and to change this discourse. It is disruptive. People are going to get mad at you. People are going to tell you that you're crazy. But this is our people. This is our land. And if we want to make sure that all of that is there for our kids, we need to do this now. So I'm going to talk a little bit about, and then Maggie will get up to, some of the work that's been going on globally around Indigenous data sovereignty, and then within the US context and within the Arizona context. And so this is a slide and a presentation from NASA, I think, that we gave. I'm going to quickly go through some other people's slides as well as some of my own in this context. But what we have now is a landscape where there are 3 formal nation-state-based Indigenous data sovereignty networks. There is one in New Zealand, one in the US, and one in Australia. And then we have nascent and emerging networks also in Canada, Sweden, and New Mexico, also in Latin America, and since our trip to Africa, now in Southern Africa as well. And so the primary focus of this, and we've utilized an entity called the Research Data Alliance, which sets forth a lot of new thought and policy around research data, so principles for data, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. And as a hosting entity for us to gather internationally, and then we also put together book proposals and all that kind of stuff to kind of generate the ability to share in person, which is really important. What we're doing, because there's a lot to learn, and the contexts aren't all the same. So for instance, in New Zealand, Maori are, I think, 13% of the population. They're a lot, percent of the population, and there's common languages, common culture, and there's only a nation state. There are no states, and so it's a different context, but there is a lot of sharing of ideas, of course, and so you see a lot of the same aspirations behind the work that they're doing there, and how they're doing that is by influencing the wider data ecosystem there. There's been a real effort to try to, New Zealand wants to be one of the premier countries in the world with respect to data. And so they're trying to advance their data by linking data and by doing all of these things. And so you hear Maori voice and in that conversation. And actually their network was created because some of their scholars were consulted based on moving forward, and they presented themselves as a group. Understanding that there's usually more power if you have a group. And so some of the work there that they have been able to advance is they have some more broad and important rights and consultation and control around research than we do in the US. Control of genomics, both human and flora and fauna, that we don't see at all here in the US, as well as conversations around presence and importance in the data ecosystem. They formed in 2015. In 2016, Desi Rodriguez-Lonebear, who is a graduate student in sociology at the U of A, also in demography at the University of Waikato in New Zealand, and myself and Andrew, who I've mentioned before, launched the US Indigenous Data Sovereignty Network, mostly to raise awareness around Indigenous data sovereignty. I'll talk about where we're moving with that now. In Canada, they have a long legacy of dealing with data in terms of health data specifically. So they have something called OCAP, which has been trademarked as community ownership, control, access, and possession. And that's primarily been for First Nations. In Canada, there's 3 distinct populations: First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. And so they're kind of in this process, and you see this beautiful Think Power map here of trying to process how do they come together as peoples to assert their rights. And how do they form a collective to assert those rights? Is it appropriate to do that? And so there's a lot of action and discussion going on there. And I'll tell you, last year the Inuit issued their research guidelines, and they took the P out of OCAP for their research guidelines. So they withdrew possession because they realized that they need to be able to assert a control even if they don't possess that data. And so that took out it being kind of focused on internal to Indigenous peoples to wherever that data may be. In Sweden and for the Sami people, there is a current law against collecting data with Indigenous or ethnic affiliation. And so there's some fear around that. So there's an increased interest in doing that specifically around health, but also there's an increased interest from the Sami broadly up in the Arctic to becoming involved in this. And so I had a researcher who went to Finland recently. She's an Indigenous woman from Citizen Potawatomi, and really began to engage around the land, having these conversations while they were fishing about what does fish have to do with data, and what's the importance and role of fish with data, which sounds like a wonky conversation if you're not a fish person, first of all, but if you're not an Indigenous person. Why is it important that the fish have a seat at the table, that they're part of the discussion and they have a voice as well? And so how do you begin to reimagine what data looked like based on your relationship with fish? And so Mary Beth, who is Citizen Potawatomi, is not from a fish culture. My cousin was with her, who is Athabascan as well. And so she was resonating with the fish thing, and Mary Beth was like, I think I finally got it. And so to be able to share that kind of experience and build that knowledge is important. I don't know why I went that way. One of the other strong areas where you see traction now is in Mexico, actually. And so this is a map of indigenous lands, recognized indigenous lands in Mexico right now. And what you have there is a timely opportunity because there's a new government this month. And they're kind of reconfiguring their bodies around indigenous peoples there. And in a lot of these spaces where you see lands, Indigenous peoples actually are governing the municipalities. And so you have Indigenous peoples who are deciding how to move forward in those areas, although you still have federal imposed systems that are saying every 3 years you need to insert a planning process. And so these don't always agree with in most of these places a new leader comes in every year. And so what do you do when you have federal requirements for 3 years, so on and so forth. And so there is an opportunity now, and for me this is really important, to influence legislation that's going forward in Mexico, not only on consultation, but because there is new government and new Congress people in there, to put in language around Indigenous data sovereignty, around knowledge and other aspects that weren't going to be included in the original legislation. And so this is an opportunity both within Mexico, but also for us as Indigenous peoples around the world, to start to think about how do we insert into nation-state legislation different aspects of rights around our knowledge and information and data. And so at the collaborative level internationally, I think there's Maggie in the middle, our queen. That was on the top of that Hollywood hill. What we're doing is working in three primary areas. So we're creating draft principles of Indigenous data. That's a sovereignty, but it's governance, and I'll show you those in a second and talk more about those. We're creating a repository of existing Indigenous data sovereignty literature and so on and so forth, but more importantly, Indigenous data governance mechanisms, documents, commentary, and critique. And so I've had a significantly rising number of requests for sharing of tribal policies on data governance, which there aren't a lot of, tribal data sharing agreements, which are usually Western looking, as well as mechanisms for creating those. And so there are a handful of tribes, more so every day, who are taking that on at the nation level of how do we create data governance policies and procedures for our nation. And how do those intersect with another area of things that we're collecting, our research review board or IRB codes, tribal-based ones. We have over 200 of them right now. And so the other question I get a lot is how do we create those or amend those so that we are honoring our data. So we're protecting it, but we're also using our data, because a lot of those existing research review boards require that research data be returned to tribes. There's no repositories in many cases. There's no person who's the caretaker. Nobody's using it. It just gets lost. 10 years later, it ends up as boxes on somebody's desk. And so there's interest in trying to be able to steward that information so that we're making sure to be able to use it in the future or to caretake of it. And so I'll talk more about that. So the data principles work comes from interest at both the community and tribal level to have tribal data governance principles. So these are kind of like the values behind data. But it also comes from our interest at the nation state level to kind of push some broad principles, but also a responsibility and an interest we feel at the international level to implement such principles. So these are for a number of reasons. One is because sometimes you have the chance to influence scientific bodies. And so either researchers or the National Science Advisors or the American Geophysical Union, bodies who are interested, particularly because of the Me Too movement, in becoming more ethical and moral in their practice. But also you can further influence the UN and other policy bodies. And so recently we worked to create some draft principles, which I don't think even Maggie has seen, that I will show you soon. So that was in the last few weeks. But what we did before that is we looked at existing data principles. And so these are all from a variety of different bodies here. And then here's some draft or practiced ones from Indigenous peoples in different nation states. And the important thing to note here is that the vast majority of these Western principles really only talk about the data, right? They're talking about making it reusable. They're talking about it making it accessible. So they're all qualities about the data. I do want to point out here that these are kind of like purpose-oriented ones, so they get a little check on the open data ones, even though I'm like the harshest on them. But these are the ones that are being really pushed hard by the European Union and by science entities to push for open science and open data. These are the values that they're pushing, and they're about data. And so what we're trying to do in our principles is to give them purpose and make them people-oriented so that scientists and governmental agencies are thinking about the impacts and also where their data are coming from. And so we do have interest, like I said, from a number of entities in using these principles, and so we're kind of under the gun to kind of get something up. So the principles that we worked up, which will be printed in a number of contexts and have a variety of appendices to them. Our primary aim is we'll have an overall, an overall kind of visioning statement above them that will align with sovereignty and self-determination, and also we're aligning with these FAIR principles because those are the ones that are being pushed internationally around scientific data. So we came up with this, and I am so not like this, but I had to go with it because it sounded good. Be fair and care. So our principles spell care. And so we talk about collective benefit. So they'll be presented in these pithy things like this. These are the draft words. But we'll also have an appendix that will have long explanations for each of them, as well as case studies for each of them that show how they're utilized or can be utilized. And so we're talking about collective benefit, authority and control, responsibility and accountability, and ethics. And ethics aligned with Indigenous ethics, not just how an individual feels ethically about things. The one thing that I'm going to pick out from the UX context is the thing that I get pushed back on the most in the US is using the word control. There's fear. There's great fear of Indigenous people having control. So I just keep using it. It was like my dissertation, I was told not to use the word sovereignty because that could be a trigger word, so I put it in the title. So we need to make sure that people understand that one of the pushbacks on control is like, ooh, what if an Indigenous nation becomes like China? And they try to, and I'm like, hey, any nation could be rogue or crazy, and to not allow an Indigenous nation to be rogue or crazy is just ridiculous. So we do have the right to control that information. I think for the Indigenous data governance resources, the most recent thing that we've done is we submitted an annual review paper on genomics research guidelines comparing Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. And the US was really sadly pathetic compared to the other countries.
They're awful.
Yeah, and so we're comparing it to to things that are bad, and we are terrible compared to it. And so that's for genomics research, but they're broadly applicable to any research scenario. And so I wrote that paper with a number of people internationally, but domestically, Nanaba Garrison from Navajo Nation was the lead author on that, and so she and I are going to issue a companion commentary berating the US on their pathetic guidelines. And also calling to action all of you for helping to push for change in that arena. And so we'll soon do a similar analysis of US tribal research codes and see how those are protecting us. And that will be revealing. It will be revealing. So right now I've got 3 students working for me, and we have, like I said, about over 200 of those tribal research codes. We will make the list public, and then there's varying levels of how much people have been willing to let us make those codes public. But our whole purpose is to be able to make as much of that public as possible, understanding the responsibility. One of the other things that we've done internationally is comment on open data and open data policy. We have a paper that will come out early next year that's part of, so the open data movement is about 10 years old now. It's feeling a lot of growing pains, and it's really realizing that it's unethical. And they're trying to realign how they operate. And one of the things that the chapters for the review of open data at 10 has done, our chapter and the gender chapter, we were not allowed to see the actual review comments, because, and there was a British guy who was leading this, and he didn't use this word, but they were offensive. And so for our chapter in the gender chapter, we only got summary comments back because they were so egregious. And so we all made sure, like the gender chapter talks about the patriarchy, and like we just keep using these words that are offensive, but to some people. But one of the things that we wanted to push for in the open data sphere is about the fact that though we're championing the rights of Indigenous people to their data, we're also pushing back on open data in general, right? And we're saying that you may feel comfortable in this landscape that you're sitting in, but there are things that you need to be thinking about, right? And so Indigenous data sovereignty really challenges and raises fundamental questions about assumptions of ownership of data and representation and control in the open data community. It also articulates the concept of collective rights, which is really confusing in that sphere. And of course, we're challenging the dominant discourse beyond Indigenous contexts. And finally, what we're looking for is to shape the open data principles to work better for us as Indigenous peoples, but also to work better for science and governments and the future of the world, basically, which is a lofty aspiration. But so kind of honing in down on the US, what you've seen going on over the past probably about 5 years. So I'm going to say, we have a long history in the US of working with, community-based participatory research and creating guidelines and trying to really work better and do science and service to communities based on community, driven processes and so on and so forth, but we haven't quite dealt with this data issue yet. And so you've seen more and more movement around that. So there's a few main efforts. So there's research, and I'll call out now, I can't even remember, this month sometime, the Urban Indian Health Institute released some preliminary data on missing and murdered Indigenous women in the US. And really, those are incomplete data. They're shocking data to a lot of people, but they're told from our perspective as Indigenous peoples, as Indigenous women. And it tells the story of how hard it is to get that information when somebody else is really telling our story for us or suppressing our story. And so so that effort is continuing. And also Anita Lucchesi, who's the graduate student who did that work as part of her dissertation work, and myself and some others are starting to look at law enforcement killings now. And to prepare that information in a similar way. Because we know in certain areas, like in Alaska, more than half the people killed by law enforcement are Native. And so that situation is replicated in many, many places and has ripple effects, as we know. And so then we're working from an education sphere, and so in the US, but also with Maggie, I taught in Sydney a short course, a 1-credit course on Indigenous data sovereignty, data for nation building. That's held at the University of Arizona in January. And I'll be teaching it with an ASU alum this year, JD Lopez. And so we'll have a nice focus on survey data and other data as part of that, in addition to the concepts and governance aspects on it. One of the things that I've really been trying to do is build up relationships around Indigenous data. So build up relationships with tribal leaders, build up relationships with tribal departments, build up relationships with our universities. That's not fun. And there's a lot of pushback there. Build up relationships with foundations. I've had a lot of interest from foundations. None of them have funded me yet. You want to know why? Because when they go back to their boards, there are fundamental things that they are doing that are in conflict with the concepts of Indigenous data sovereignty. And it is earth-shattering to them. And so actually one of them hopefully will give me some money soon. But it has been 2 years of working with them and having internal struggles there, kind of me stepping back and being like, you deal with your stuff over there. And then working with professional organizations and international organizations as well. So one of the things we did nationally here last June was the National Congress of American Indians. So this was sponsored by Joe Garcia, the Honorable Joe Garcia from Okayawingay, put up a resolution to support Indigenous data sovereignty and also to develop tribal data governance principles at the national level here in the U.S. And so that came through, and we're trying to figure out how to work in that direction right now, and how to gather support with such a diverse set of nations and peoples in the U.S. So, because we all have varying degrees of opinions and assertions and all of that kind of stuff, and so how do we build this momentum? Because sometimes you do get pushback even from our Native scholars. So those list of care principles that I put up. Some people in leadership roles, strong national level leadership roles, don't support them. And I'm sitting there looking at them, I'm like, do you think they don't support sovereignty? What are they not supporting? Like, it's really difficult for me sometimes, but working through that and pushing this forward is important. And so one of the things from an academic perspective that I like to make sure to talk about is that there is the importance of relationships if you're doing academic work or community outreach, but also we need to make sure we're supporting our Indigenous scholars, especially our rising Indigenous scholars, to do work in the academy, but also to do work in their community or in a community that they are choosing to live in. And so part of this is to rethink how we're working publications. And so that's making sure to include both our academic and our community scholars on publications and making that easy for them. How do we make publication easy for scholars? You can interview them. You can write with them. You can use Google Docs. You can have them just scratch something down on a piece of paper. You have to be imaginative in how you make this work, because it is laborious to write a paper. We all know that. But there are many ways to include voice in papers. And so that is only one aspect of it. But also making sure that we're allowing and supporting people to present at conferences and to be, and this is the trickiest one, that who's in the review process for both journals and for grants. We need to get ourselves there now. And that's something that, I'm a new scholar, I'm an assistant professor. I don't have a lot of time for that. And so it's really hard to make that be something that is a viable option. And so for the people that I mentor, I make sure that's part of their job, so that they have the time carved out to do those things, because nobody gave me that luxury. And so I want to hear their voices in that place. I think the other thing is we need to make sure that we're supporting research and data governance by tribes and Indigenous organizations. And so many tribes already have data governance processes and policies in place. Sometimes we don't think of them as that. And so, like, for instance, if you don't allow people to come to certain ceremonies, that's technically that's data governance right there. And so we need to rethink and amplify these things that we're already doing, because we already have the capacity and the capability. How do we build on that? And how do we make sure that we're supporting that? And so back to the publications thing, especially in this world of open data and open science, many publications want you to put out your data or to put out your work in the public sphere. And in the Indigenous data sovereignty world, you just can't do that. There's all sorts of policies and procedures and processes that you need to follow. And so it's a constant process of educating the journals and so on and so forth. Although we will soon write a paper on that so that it's citable, so that you can say, look, no, we don't have to do this. So one of the things that we will be doing here in Arizona, and this is a provocation and an invitation to ever be here at ASU. So the Intertribal Council of Arizona and the University of Arizona Native faculty and the Native Nations Institute, and whoever would like to support it here from Arizona State University, will be hosting an Arizona Indigenous Data Sovereignty Summit here in the Phoenix area in the spring. That hasn't, I will be talking with ITCA next week to kind of start choosing the dates, and then we'll have a bigger meeting in January to start planning for that. And I would love to have some connection here with ASU.
SST will
Okay, I will remember that. It's being filmed. So, and that will be geared towards and based off of some work that Maggie's done in Australia, and that's happened in New Zealand as well, and has happened in New Mexico out of their tribal epicenter there, and through the pueblos there, is to bring together tribal leaders in Arizona, our urban Indian entities, our intertribal organizations, and state folks, to all come to a place where we have the same level of understanding of Indigenous data sovereignty, Indigenous data, and try to move forward, not always together, but from the same place, to promote our rights in the state of Arizona as Indigenous peoples with regards to the data about us and the data that we generate as well. And then I always like to kind of end with this kind of asking you, what can you do? What can you do to make the invisible visible? How can you unapologetically challenge those with privilege? There's actually Abigail Echohawk from the Urban Indian Health Institute often talks about how big is your brave? How much can you put yourself out there? What's your specialty in putting yourself out there? I don't particularly like public speaking. I look at Abigail Echohawk and I'm like, darn, she's good. But I'm like a party host. I can like pick the right people to bring together to have a good conversation and to create whatever needs to come out of that. So I know what I'm good at, what I'm not good at. And so we all need to reflect on who we are, our position in this world, whether you're Indigenous or not. How can you support and promote Indigenous data sovereignty and the rights of Indigenous people to govern their data? This is a frequency map, actually, of words. And I will just point out that we always, when I ask people before I talk about Indigenous data sovereignty to write what they think it is, one of the most common responses is control. So all those people who complain about it, get over it. We're talking control over here all the time.
Well, thank you. Wow. A lot of material, just so important. Let's first thank them all.